G'day, welcome to Pay It Forward. I'm Lisa Pay and today I'm going to be showing you how to make the first in a series of little patterns that I like to call button heads. Today's will be the little koala. So if you'd like to make it along with me, simply click on the link in the description below. You can print out your free PDF pattern templates and we'll get started. So to begin with our little koala button head, here are the pattern pieces we'll need. You'll need a body front and a body back. Both should have interfacing applied. You'll need a base for the body with interfacing applied. You'll then need your two thigh pieces and your two arm pieces, which should have fusible web applied. You need your two head pieces, back and front, and they will have interfacing. You'll need your muzzle piece, fusible web applied, two ear pieces with fusible web, two eye patches with fusible web, your little nose again with fusible web, and your two little leaves for the front there, all with fusible web applied. You will also need two suitable buttons for eyes, quite small, 2-hole if you can, and also a larger button for the back, because that's why we call him a button head. That's how we attach his head. You'll also need some clear craft glue, your general sewing requirements, and a little bit of stuffing, and I like to use a little bit of, I actually use dried rice to fill the base of that little button head to give him a little bit of weight. So to begin with, our first task is to take our body front, which I always make in an off-white, and then we're going to add first up our leaves, and we're going to sew a machine stitching line over our two leaves, running down and back up again, just to create the look of a stem there. So best way to check your positioning is to place your little thigh and arm pieces on, so that will show you exactly where. If you have a good look at this one, they're really quite close to each other. You'll find that they'll fit in beautifully along the sides of your pattern piece. So just to give you an idea, now those two little hands are going to overlap, and then you can get an idea of where you want to place your leaves. It's not a perfect science, it's just where you think they'll look good. You can see that we'll pop them on fairly close to where the little hands are. We're just going to fuse those on with a hot iron and a protective cloth. So we fuse only the leaves at this stage. Check that you've got your positioning right, then we'll come back. So I have fused my little leaves in place. I'm now going to, I threaded up my machine with a green thread, and I'm going to sew down the centre of each leaf. So I'll start at the top of the leaf and I'll go straight down the machine, then backtrack, back up and sew on the other leaf. So starting at this side, up and back again, just to create those little stalks. This centre line is about 3.5 centimetres down the middle. So now that I have sewn my little stem line in, you can go ahead and fuse your little arm and thigh pieces into place. Again with a hot iron and protective cloth, just overlap those two little hand pieces and line them up at the base. So now our little arm and thigh pieces are fused into place. There's two ways that we can treat these edges here. You can see on this little one I've used a blanket applique stitch, which is what I usually do. We also use that stitch on the face. For the sake of time today, I'm going to show you also another alternative. They don't have to be quite so labour intensive if you're wanting to make them a little quicker. You can use your machine and sew just very close to the edge top stitch around all of those edges there where I've done that little embellishment. So I'm going to do that on the machine today. I will match the thread fairly close to the colour of the arms and the thighs, and I'll show you that result. So there's our little arm and thigh pieces machined on, you can see that's a lovely neat result. Just a little tip while we're here, when you're machining any applique pieces and you stop in the middle of your work there, you'll end up with your machine threads remaining. Best results are achieved if you don't cut the thread there. We just want it as tidy as possible, and it's the little things like this that make all the difference to the finish in the end. So you re-thread that top thread rather than cutting it off. Re-thread it onto your little needle and just pop it straight back in and pull it through to the back. And then that stitching line there is never going to pull up or come away because you've pulled that through. So it just makes a big difference to the finished result. Our next step is to sew our body front to our body back. So it's just right sides together. You'll see that you have two little marks on your body back. That is where your stitching begins on each side. You sew right down each side. On the machine, make sure that you go back and forth a little at the start because we're going to be turning that one through, and your seam allowance is quite tiny. It's only about 3 millimeters. So now that you have those side seams sewn, it's time to pop in our base. Now I do have a video. If you look up Lisa Pay, it's my other channel, Lisa Pay, How to Sew a Stab Back Stitch. I actually run through nice and up close how to sew in this exact project, this circle into a button head body. So it might be worth popping over there and having a look at that one. So we're just going to pin that one in, just quickly to show you. Just find anywhere. I usually start in the centre. Pin goes through both layers. Flip your work over, and then you just take a little from the other side and pin head all the way down to clamp that down. And you just make your way all around the circle. If you followed those seam allowance sizes correctly, you'll find that that little circle will fit beautifully in there. So I'm going to pin that all the way around. So you can see that I have pinned that little circle in all the way around there, and that fits in really nicely. I've threaded up my needle with an extra strong upholstery thread, and I'm just going to sew a little overcasting stitch, a little tacking stitch, all the way around the outside before I actually sew my seam with a stab back stitch. That just allows me to remove the pins and makes the job a lot easier. So now that little circle is all tacked into place, I'm going to show you a couple of stitches on the stab back stitch. So still with your extra strong upholstery thread, our seam allowance again is about 3 to 4 millimeters. We come in from behind and we make our first stitch, quite tiny stitches, again 2 to 3 mil, all the way through. With my first stitch, I always come back in where I started. Might be a bit hard to see, that's why my video will show you really up close when I'm using a darker thread. So check out that video. So I've just done a double stitch there, and now I'm coming in from behind. I'm going to make my second little stitch, which is about 3 millimeters, then back into the same hole I just came out of. And you'll see that that stitch is linked back into its own starting point all the way around. So you can see I've got 3 stitches there and they're all completely linked. It's a very, very strong stitch, and that's why we use it for this sort of work. So you make your way all the way around that little circle. So with our little base sewn in, I've turned that one through, and it's very important that you roll out all of those seams between your thumbs and your forefingers, and that way you get a nice rounded edge. Now we're going to add our rice, or you could use plastic filling pellets if you have them. Now we're going to just fill that little body, settling it down as you go, and I'm going to fill with rice or pellets just up until about where the hands meet there. So I filled with rice up to about here. Now I'm just going to add my polyester stuffing, just a standard polyester stuffing, and we want to fill and pack very firmly especially out the side seams, so you get nice pushed out side seams. I'm going to fill that body right up to the top, just allowing room to be able to pinch the top closed. So I filled that little body right up to the top with my polyester filling. I've popped a pin at the top and just matched up those top edges. I'm using an embroidery thread here. I'm using 3 strands of stranded cotton, and we're going to sew that seam together, close that seam using a standard blanket stitch. I do have a up close video on my other channel, Lisa Pay, how to sew the blanket stitch, that shows you very clearly how to make this stitch. I've done a couple there. I've just started where our machine stitching ended. Our stitches are only around about 3 millimeters again, and they will provide that nice binding edge to hold those 2 pieces together. So you can see that we're just going through both layers with our needle right through to the back. Bring your needle out through your loop, pull it nice and firm, and that will give you that nice neat binding edge, and we'll follow that all the way around to the other side. So there's our little body all done, ready. We can set that one aside. Now we'll start working on the head. So you take your front head piece, and we're going to apply our muzzle piece, our ears and our eye patches and our nose. So the muzzle piece gets centered. The distance between the bottom of that face pattern piece and the muzzle is 1 centimeter. You then fuse your little nose over the top of that piece, and the distance between the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the muzzle is 1.5 centimeters. Make sure that it's all nice and centered and even. Line up your eyes either side, again keeping them even, and your little ear inserts there. They sit on the lower edge of the ear, so we have more room this side. And remember that you need to be able to make that stitching all around the outside of the ear, so you must leave room for that. So fuse those on with a hot iron and a protective cloth. So now that all our pattern pieces are fused into place, I'm going to work a blanket applique stitch all around the outside of each one of these pattern pieces. I do have a video on my other channel, Lisa Pay, how to sew a blanket applique or buttonhole stitch, and it will show you exactly how to do that. I'm using an extra strong upholstery thread, and I'm just coordinating my colours with my pattern pieces here. I'll show you a couple of stitches. So we're keeping them nice and small. We've come in from behind, started with a knot, come in from behind, and just come probably 2 to 3 millimeters, keeping our stitches nice and even, coming out right on that edge there, and coming through the loop. And that makes that nice binding. You can, if you would prefer, you can sew top stitch as we did before on the body. You can top stitch those pieces on the machine if you like, if you want to speed up the process, but I'm going to work each of those pattern pieces with the same stitch. And you can see I've sewn around all of those pattern pieces, and I've also marked in a little mouth. Now I've just done a little half cheeky smile there. You can put a full smile if you like. I've just marked it in with a little permanent marker where I'm going to stitch. You can use the bottom of a cotton reel, anything like that, just as a guide, just so that you can sew that in. Now I'm going to sew that little mouth line in using some embroidery thread. I'm actually using 3 strands of stranded cotton, and I'm just going to come in from behind. I've made a knot in the end of my thread. I'm going to start at the very first point where I've marked there, and it's just a back stitch. It's just a linked back stitch that we use. Keep your stitches quite small so we can make that little line curve, and we're just going to link that stitch up all the way around. So back in from behind, all the way through and back in where we just came out from the other stitch. That's what will link it up nicely, and it will follow a nice continuous line, and we'll just make that stitch all the way up to the top. So there's that little cheeky Aussie smile sewn in there. Next we're going to put the head together. We actually sew the eyes on after the head is assembled, so it's just a matter of putting right sides together, and you can see that they'll match up beautifully. And you're going to sew on your machine from the base of that ear right round the lower chin line to the base of that ear. Make sure that you back and forth on these starting points on your machine so that it's nice and strong. So with that machine line sewn, we're just going to turn that through. I like to use my knitting needle to push those seams out and roll those seams as we always do. There's your little koala face. We're going to add just a little bit of stuffing. We just want to fill out the bottom part of his chin line. It's really just to add a little bit of volume, because we need to be able to close that little seam line at the top. So we really need to just fill just up to about here so that we can pinch that in. So I've just filled up there just enough so that I've been able to put a pin through. Now next step is just to glue that top line. I'm using clear craft glue here because it dries and remains just that little bit flexible, and it is quick drying, but it's not so strong that we can't get a needle through it afterwards. So the whole ear section needs to be glued and sealed, and you can use anything you like to help clamp that down for you while that's drying. I like to use alligator clips. I'm going to glue the other ear. And then we'll do the same across the top of the head. Remove that pin, glue just across the top of the head there, clamp that down and let that dry for probably about 10 to 15 minutes. So now our ears and top of our head is nicely dried. I'm using 3 strands of embroidery cotton, and we're going to work a blanket stitch around the full outside of each ear, across the top of the head and down to the other side, just as you can see on this one, all the way around, just as we did. It's done in exactly the same way as we just did on the body top. So there we have top line all stitched. Now we have our little blind koala who needs his eyes. So we're just going to sew those on. The reason why we've left them until now is that so that we can sew them on and we get that nice pulled in effect, sewing from behind. Also, we want to have the eyes actually pull back and inwards. So we're going to start in the center back of the head. So this is our starting point. Don't worry about knots showing, because this is how the head is attached to the body. So we can just go straight in through there. We use a 2-hole button if possible, just because it's a better look. And try and position that eye in the top region there. Once you've got an idea of where that is, there's 2 ways of doing it. You can hold your button there and try and find your hole, or you can estimate where that button will sit, where that hole will be, and come through. Thread your button on, back through, and try and head out again into the centre. Pull your button up and see, and make sure that your threads aren't twisted. And you can see just by one little stitch there, that's going to pull that in really nicely. See how it's sitting just at the top of the eye there, and make that little slant go across. So just stitch that one on and then stitch the other one on in exactly the same way. So now the final step is to attach our little koala's head to his body. We're going to do that using our button. I've threaded up to double upholstery thread. I'm using a longer needle. You don't have to use a longer needle, I just find I've got more control that way. And I've marked in the position of where I want the head to actually sit. It's quite central on the front there, so I've just marked a little spot there, and also it's quite central on the back there also, you can see with the other one. So I've got a little mark here, and this is where I'm going to start. So we thread first through our button. We only need a 2-hole button, but most of them this size are a 4-hole. We'll only use 2. So through the button first, and then we're going to enter in at the back. We're going to come out one side of our spot. We're going to come through. On the back of the head I've made a little mark that shows me around about where I want the head to be attached. So I'm going to dive my needle in. I want to take up a fair bit of stuffing and fabric when I do that, so that that's a good hold. Make sure that you've centered it. Come out the other side just the same. And then we're just going to repeat the process. We're now going to go back through the body. We're going to exit back at the back of the body and through the button again. So what we should have now is that effect. So we've gone in with our needle through all the layers, back again through, out the button, and you can see that that will just pull it all in. Check from the front, position your little head, pull it in, make sure that you've got some room for movement there, and it's a simple matter of tying off those thread ends. I usually tie them off about 4 times, rethread the ends onto my needle and sink them back into the body. So there he is, all finished. 2 cheeky koalas. Well, I hope you've enjoyed making one of my very favourite Aussie animals. If you have, you could give this video a thumbs up. That would be beaut. Remember to subscribe, because I've got many more of these little button head patterns coming up. You don't want to miss any. Thanks to all of you who are already subscribers. Remember to comment, because I love to hear what you've got to say. And remember, most of all, to pay it forward, because everybody can. And until next time, it's hooroo from me.